The door closed softly, but the sound carried weight. Not the kind that echoed, the kind that settled. Inside the room, no one rushed to speak. Cigarette smoke hung low, heavy enough to taste, curling around the single bulb that threw tired light onto a bare wooden table. This wasn't a meeting about territory. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. And every man in that room understood that once the words started, there would be no walking them back. If you want to understand how the American Mafia truly became untouchable, forget the headlines, forget the gunshots. It started here, quiet, calculated, behind closed doors. And if stories like this matter to you, make sure you're subscribed, because this one doesn't get told the way it should. Meyer Lansky sat perfectly still, hands folded, back straight, eyes alert. He looked like he didn't belong. No flashy suit, no loud jewelry, no theatrical gestures. Just a small man with a calm face and the unsettling habit of listening longer than everyone else. People who didn't know better thought that meant weakness. The people who survived knew it meant something else entirely. Lucky Luciano arrived late on purpose. He always did. It was a reminder, subtle but deliberate, of who everyone believed was in charge. He filled the doorway without raising his voice, confidence wrapped around him like a tailored coat. This was his world, or at least it had been. He took his seat across from Lansky, nodded once, and lit a cigarette without asking. For a moment they studied each other. Old friends, some said. Others called them partners. The truth was more complicated. They had come up together, bled together, made money together. But the world around them was changing faster than bullets could solve. Prohibition was cracking. Old bosses were clinging to outdated rules. The streets were louder, messier, and far more dangerous than they used to be. Luciano broke the silence first. Not with threats, not with charm, but with frustration. He spoke about instability, about crews fighting crews, about men killing over pride instead of profit. He talked like a king tired of cleaning up the mess left by lesser men. To anyone else in the room, it sounded like authority. To Lansky, it sounded like a problem begging to be solved. When Lansky finally spoke, his voice was low and precise. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He laid out numbers, arrest rates, lost revenue, heat from politicians who suddenly wanted headlines. He talked about efficiency the way other men talked about honor. Every sentence cut quietly, removing illusion after illusion without raising his tone. This wasn't about loyalty to old traditions, Lansky explained. It was about building something that couldn't collapse every time a boss got emotional. Violence attracted attention. Attention attracted law enforcement. And law enforcement, once interested, never forgot. The old structure wasn't just outdated, it was suicidal. Luciano listened, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. He wasn't stupid. He could feel the shift happening even before Lansky named it. This wasn't a challenge for control. It was worse. It was a proposal that would make individual power smaller, but collective power absolute. No more kings, no more public wars. A system instead of an ego. Around them, the room stayed silent. Men understood they were witnessing something dangerous. Not a betrayal, not an alliance, but a redesign of how crime itself would function. If Luciano said no, blood would follow. If he said yes, nothing would look the same again. Lansky leaned back slightly, not pressing, not selling. He had already done the work. He knew Luciano hated chaos more than he loved dominance. And in that stillness, the future of the Mafia waited, balanced not on a gun, but on a decision that would never make the papers. Luciano didn't answer right away. He tapped ash into a glass tray and watched it fall like he was measuring time itself. Around him, the men waited, knowing better than to interrupt a silence that belonged to Lucky Luciano. He had built his reputation on instinct and force, but this moment demanded something else. He finally looked up at Lansky, not with anger, but with something closer to suspicion. "You're asking me to cut my own legs out," he said calmly. Lansky didn't deny it. He said yes, but only so you can stop bleeding. The room stiffened. This wasn't how power was discussed. Bosses weren't supposed to be told they were wounded. But Lansky didn't flinch. He explained that bosses who ruled alone always ended the same way, either in prison or in the ground. He said the future didn't belong to the loudest man in the room. It belonged to the one who could disappear behind a system and still control it. Luciano leaned back, eyes narrowing, replaying every war he'd fought, every man he'd lost, every shipment seized because someone wanted to prove they were fearless. Fearless men were expensive, Lansky continued, and they were terrible for business. He talked about a commission, not as an idea, but as an inevitability, a board instead of a throne, shared decisions instead of vendettas, profit before pride. Luciano smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You want me to trust men I've spent years keeping in line," he said. Lansky corrected him. "You won't trust them. You'll control the rules they can't break." That landed differently. Luciano understood rules. Rules could be enforced quietly. Rules could survive prison sentences. Rules could outlive the men who created them. He asked who would really run this thing. Lansky answered honestly, "Whoever understands it best." The implication didn't need to be spoken. Luciano stared at him longer now, seeing not the boy he grew up with, but the architect behind the curtain. For the first time in that room, Luciano realized that violence had always been Lansky's backup plan, never his strategy. The realization was unsettling. He asked what happened to men who refused. Lansky said they'd be allowed to make mistakes once. After that, they'd remove themselves from the picture. Luciano laughed softly. Clean. Efficient. He said the old bosses would never agree. Lansky replied that they didn't have to. Pressure would do the convincing. Arrests, cut income, strategic isolation, no blood if possible. Luciano exhaled slowly. He could see it now, a mafia that didn't tear itself apart every decade, a structure that made him less visible and more powerful at the same time. He hated how much sense it made. He hated even more that he needed it. The room waited for his decision, knowing that once it was spoken, there would be no return to the old ways. Luciano finally nodded once. Not agreement. Acceptance. "Do it," he said. "But if this collapses, it collapses on your head." Lansky nodded back, already thinking 10 steps ahead, already planning for a world where the mafia wouldn't need kings anymore. The agreement didn't end the tension, it sharpened it. Once Luciano gave the nod, the room didn't relax. It recalibrated. Men shifted in their chairs, realizing they weren't witnesses anymore. They were liabilities. Plans were already dangerous, but plans spoken aloud became evidence if they landed in the wrong ears. Luciano stood first, signaling the meeting was over without saying it. He reminded everyone that nothing discussed in that room existed outside of it. No notes, no stories, no loose talk in social clubs or bedrooms. Anyone who forgot that would disappear so completely even rumors wouldn't find them. Then he left, coat over his shoulder, the face of a king who had just agreed to make himself less visible. Lansky stayed seated. That was always his way. Let the others move first. Let them reveal who was nervous, who was calculating, who was already thinking about betrayal. He watched them file out, already sorting names into categories that would matter later. Useful, unreliable, temporary. Once the room was empty, Lansky allowed himself a single slow breath. This was the dangerous part people never understood. Not the violence, not the prisons, the transition. Old systems fought hardest when they sensed extinction. Over the following weeks, the shift began quietly. No announcements, no declarations, just pressure applied in precise places. A shipment delayed here, a connection suddenly unavailable there. A prosecutor receiving information that pointed just close enough to cause panic. Bosses who refused to cooperate found themselves isolated, their own crews questioning their judgment as money dried up and heat increased. Some adapted quickly, sensing which way the wind was blowing. Others clung to pride and paid for it, not always with bullets, but with relevance. Lansky and Luciano met again and again, always privately, refining the structure. Territories redrawn not by tradition but by profitability. Disputes resolved by arbitration instead of funerals. Violence wasn't eliminated, it was regulated, treated like a last resort instead of a first impulse. The Mafia stopped behaving like a collection of gangs and started operating like a corporation. Law enforcement noticed the change but couldn't explain it. Crime didn't vanish, it became quieter, cleaner, less emotional. Witnesses were harder to find because fewer people even knew who made the decisions. Luciano became the public symbol, the man everyone believed was in charge. That suited him. It drew attention away from the real nerve center. Lansky never needed a title. His power lived in spreadsheets, in offshore accounts, in the simple fact that nothing moved without his approval. When Luciano was eventually arrested and deported, the system didn't collapse. That was the final proof the meeting had worked. Kings could be removed. The structure remained. Money kept flowing. Orders kept being followed. The Mafia had achieved something no criminal organization had managed before: continuity. Years later, men would argue about who really ran things, whose name deserved to be feared most. Those arguments missed the point. Power had stopped being a face and become a mechanism. And that mechanism was born the moment Meyer Lansky convinced Lucky Luciano to think past himself. No shots were fired, no bodies dropped. Yet the future of organized crime was sealed that night, not by force, but by a quiet understanding that survival belonged to those willing to evolve. Years passed and the streets never noticed the hand that steadied them. Newspapers chased gunmen and courtroom drama, never understanding why the chaos they expected never fully came. The commission operated in shadows, disputes handled in rooms without windows, decisions recorded only in memory. Crews that once would have gone to war now waited for permission, not because they feared Luciano, not because they feared prison, but because money moved faster when nobody panicked. Lansky watched everything from a distance, his name rarely spoken aloud, his influence felt in every deal that didn't explode into violence. Casinos rose in places no one thought to look. Investments flowed through cities that never asked questions. Politicians were paid not to act, which proved far more effective than threats. Luciano, even from exile, remained the symbol, the ghost king, whose approval still mattered. But symbols were replaceable. The system was not. Younger men entered the life believing power came from reputation. They learned quickly that reputation without structure meant nothing. Those who resisted the new order found themselves broke, surrounded, irrelevant, not dead, forgotten. Law enforcement kept searching for the next Luciano, the next headline villain, never realizing they were hunting a shadow that no longer needed a face. Lansky understood that attention was the real enemy. The quieter the machine ran, the longer it lived. By the time the government realized organized crime wasn't collapsing but stabilizing, it was too late to pull it apart. Every arrest removed a piece without damaging the framework. Every conviction proved the model worked. Years later, when old associates reminisced, they talked about that meeting as if it were casual, just two men talking business. But those who truly understood knew better. That room marked the moment crime stopped being emotional and became institutional. No loyalty to bloodlines, no obsession with tradition, just rules, profit, and patience. Luciano had given up the illusion of absolute control and gained something far more durable. Lansky never needed credit. History rarely remembers the engineer, only the structure that refuses to fall. And that was the real outcome of that night. Not dominance, permanence. If this story changed the way you see power, make sure you're subscribed, because the real history is always quieter than the myths, and the next one goes even deeper.